Thank you very much, and my sincere apologies for arriving late. I think I underestimated the challenges of getting to town for those of us who are outsiders in the sense of having business in downtown. The question regarding, in my view, the role of the media and whether it's engaged with issues of national interest is a fairly interesting, but I think we need to first explore and figure out what exactly do we mean by media. Is media a broad entity that works from one point of view, or do we have media in a fairly diversified manner so that there probably are medias rather than media? Rather than medium, looking at it from a collective, let me mess up English a little bit and talk about medias rather than media. In the studies that we come across, just to explore how how spread the media is. Today, nearly 96% of Kenyans can access radio in its various, the radio receiver, whether on their cell phones, on other types of platforms, be it on in their cars, whichever way. About 96% of Kenyans are able to access the medium of radio. But out of that, probably about 80% have access to cell phones. And cell phones, whichever form we look at it, and particularly if you reflect back in 2007 elections, and you probably noticed the extent to which the cell phones were used to distribute messages that were touching on the elections, then it becomes a fairly critical medium. I don't think today, this election, that the cell phone has been used broadly in the same format that it had been used in 2007. Nearly 56% of Kenyans access the print media. And again, we talk about accessing the print media here, we are taking into account the fact that a lot of those consumers are accessing media as a Passover. Somebody else bought the medium, the newspaper, but then the readership is about 10 or 12 or 15% of this, 15 people reading the same newspaper. We're taking into account here some areas where the newspaper will take probably a week to arrive and will be read over and over again. And about 37% of our audience access the TV receivers, so they're able to access this content. And of course, we take into account the format in which people tend to receive the news. They view the television, some of them communally, in other formats. And about 23% are accessing the social media. And again, when we talk about accessing the social media, it's critical to take into account what kind of content they're accessing on the social media. Now, looking at that whole spread, it may be worthwhile categorizing media in probably two forms. The first is the mainstream media, what one would consider the media that appeals to the elite. And here you would probably categorize the Nation Media Group, the Standard Group, the Media Max, the Royal Media, Radio Africa Group, among others. And then there's the media that appeals to the broad range of the population. And I think to a great extent, again, you find the Royal Media in this category, you find Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, and the myriad vernacular stations that are reaching the public in the various places where they are. But who are listening to this media? And when we talk about the elite media, I think it tends to appeal to also the elite of the city. I mean, guys who are found in the urban areas, Nairobi, Eldoret, Kisumu, Mombasa, etc., etc. And even if they are in the rural, they tend to be more, it's the nature of the print medium to appeal to the more literate members of society. And the other population tends to appeal to, tends to be reached much more by the vernacular stations. Now, when we talk about the folks who tend to be reached by the vernacular stations, they don't necessarily have to be in rural areas, but too often they tend to have certain characteristics that run across them, that bring together the rural, in a sense, merges the rural together with the urban. And so you create a constituency that tends to be appealed to by this media. And so the mind that one tends to take into account here is that these are people who are bound together by language, by ethnic affinity, those who listen to vernacular stations. And so the content, the subject of conversation tends to be fairly regional and fairly matters that are of interest to that specific community. Too often, issues that are not of interest to them will probably, which may be of national interest, but which are not of interest to them may not be as thoroughly covered. But again, in terms of the content, part of the content that will probably appeal to this audience will include music, will include proverbs, and sometimes content that promotes ethnic nationalism. Now, when we talk about the broad media categorization, then we divide the kind of audience and the kind of segments of society that this media appeal to. Then the question that you are raising, whether the appeal to national interest is fairly interesting. But before we address that, I think it's important to find out what is the motive behind media publication or media management. And too often, in my view, it's basically political economy. The profit motive is overarching in terms of why people establish media are not established for charitable functions, but largely to be able to make profit. And so to what extent does the content drive that profit motive? And if they drive that profit motive, then obviously that content is going to be carried. Now, does that profit motive coalesce? Does it align itself with the national interest? But as we talk about the national interest, I think it's critical to understand what exactly is the national interest and how has that national interest been articulated or spelled out so that media can be able to pick it up. And if media are picking up, are driven by this profit motive, whatever content that they're going to carry will be packaged in such a format that it will help to attract advertisers, increase circulation. And to be able to focus on that national interest, then we need to understand what the national values are. And you make reference to the preamble to the Constitution, which spells out the national values. But the critical question that we probably need to address ourselves to is, to what extent have we lifted the national values from the Constitution and put them into the marketplace? So that the average person on the street, whether it's an elite in the urban or the hoi polloi in the countryside, is able to identify with that national interest. So we expect the media to be able to articulate that national interest, but we have not articulated that national interest. It's been spelled out in the Constitution, in the preamble of the Constitution, but probably not lifted from there to be placed in the public domain so that the public can be able to interact with it. If you ask an average citizen on the street, what are our national values? It may be a little challenging to be able to address that. What are the principles of governance that we subscribe to? And one would probably say these are works in progress that we need to be able to deal with. Now, the average person who listens to the media, what is his profile? And I would, one of the editors describing the average listener described it as fairly a folk who probably works as a clerk, lives up in the country, in the city, in the urban center, whether that be some town in the counties, probably has one foot in the village, in a sense, one foot in the countryside and another foot in the urban. So it's able to really cross these two societies, not completely alienated from the one and kind of touching onto the other. So here we're not so much focusing on the national elite, the guy who is so urban and in the city, because that population is comparatively small. So the big chunk of the folk will be this other individual. But what are the priorities of that individual? Is it the focusing on the national interest or focusing on the communal interest, the community to which that person is engaged with from time to time, whether by telephone calls or by interaction going back to that background? And my submission would be that that average individual is not so much concerned with this overarching idea of national values or governance principles, but much more concerned with the day-to-day issues of bread and butter. And the media tends to appeal to that person, but also to the extent that the media, we have not yet articulated to them and what these national values are. It's very difficult to expect them to be able to articulate that. And because the media is driven by a profit motive, then what seems to enhance that profit motive will be much more of critical importance to the media than the national values that have not been clearly spelled out to the media. Thank you.